Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Harmon, Executive Director of the George Wright Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Crop Wild Relatives in Biosphere Regions. The webinar is organized by the United States Biosphere Network in collaboration with the George Wright Society and Southern Appalachian Man in the Biosphere. You are viewing the slides that were prepared for the webinar by our moderator, Stephanie Greene of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Unfortunately, we had a problem with the very beginning of the webinar recording, and Stephanie's brief spoken introduction to the event is unavailable. What you are viewing now is a substitute introduction we recorded. After I quickly take us through Stephanie's opening slides, we will segue to the recording of the live webinar, including Stephanie's original moderation. Stephanie began by explaining the mission of the webinar's primary organizer, the United States Biosphere Network, a summary of which you see here. It's worth noting that the term Biosphere Regions in the webinar's title is the name now used in the United States for what are known elsewhere as biosphere reserves. She then introduced the definition of crop wild relatives, which the USDA defines as a plant species occurring in the wild that is either the congener of a crop species, that is, the species from which the crop was domesticated, or else a closely related species in the same genus to a particular domesticated crop species. Stephanie concluded her introduction by going over the agenda that you see here. As the webinar turned out, we were able to follow the agenda closely, and the event concluded in the 2 hours we allotted. So with that, we will now go to the recording of the live webinar as it was presented on October 18th, 2022. Our first speaker, Anne Francis, will present Crop Wild Relatives in the United States, Reservoirs of Crop Plant Diversity.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I wanted to thank all of you for being here today. A special thanks to the organizers who put together this workshop. And as Stephanie mentioned, I am with the USDA National Germplasm Resources Laboratory, and I've been here a little over a year. Previously, I worked at a nonprofit called conserve, where I focused on the conservation of rare plants. But I've always been interested in ethnobotany and economic botany. So in this job, being able to focus on crop wild relatives is bringing me full circle. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge Karen Williams, who you will hear from next. She's taught me a tremendous amount over the past year and provided lots of material for this slideshow. So for today's presentation, I'm going to start out with some background on crop wild relatives and why they're important. And then I will take a deeper dive into talking about the crop wild relatives of the United States and a lot of the progress that's been made in the past 10 years. So it's always good to start with a definition. I like the one on top. It's very simply stated. It says that crop wild relatives are wild plant taxa that are closely related to crop species. They are either the direct ancestors of crops or other closely related taxa. But if you wanted a more academic definition, you could turn to Max Stead et al. From their article in 2006, where they say that a crop wild relative is a wild plant taxon that has an indirect use derived from its relatively close genetic relationship to a crop. So one reason why we care about crop wild relatives is that they're important to agriculture. We also recognize that every plant and animal and component of an ecosystem is worthy of conservation, whether or not they're important to humans or not. But in the case of crop wild relatives and coming from the agricultural community, this is where we see their value. Crop wild relatives have successfully been used in plant breeding programs for many decades, and they contribute to things like improved yield and nutritional content. They're used a lot for their key traits in terms of their pest and disease resistance and their tolerance to abiotic stresses. And one example I wanted to bring up from the United States is the Pico sunflower, or Helianthus paradoxus. It is tolerant of saline conditions. So that trait is used in breeding with the annual sunflower, Helianthus annuus, which is the cultivated one, to confer that trait of salinity tolerance. Okay, this slide has a lot of information in it, and we're not going to go over all of it. It's basically a slide of crop wild relatives native to the United States and their agronomic uses and traits. And so as you scroll through this, you may see some species that you're familiar with, and you may learn about some uses of them as crop wild relatives that you may not have known before. The use of crop wild relatives has really increased over the past few decades as advancements in breeding, particularly through novel molecular approaches, have increased the efficiency of the use of wild germplasm substantially. And this may be really important to adapting agriculture to climate change. So when talking about crop wild relatives, it's important to understand the plant breeders concept of them. And that's because this plant breeders concept is used to categorize and prioritize crop wild relatives. So the standard classification we use is the Harlan and DeWitt gene pool, and it basically divides crop wild relatives into three categories based on how closely related they are to the crop. So for example, in the primary gene pool, I'm going to use my laser pointer. The primary gene pool, this includes the crop species itself and any wild populations of that crop species. And the secondary gene pool, this includes other species that can cross with the crop, sometimes with some difficulty. And in the tertiary gene pool, we have species that can only be crossed with the crop using radical techniques. It's also important to consider graft stalk and rootstock as crop wild relatives. In this image here, we see a grapevine growing. This image is from Grape Rootstocks for Michigan. And what we see on the bottom here is the rootstock, which is called the SO4 rootstock. And then in this section, the graft union. And then the scion up on top is Cabernet Franc, and that's the kind of wine grape that they're growing. Now, what's interesting to me is that this SO4 rootstock, first of all, it's so named because it's called Selection Oppenheim 4. And it was created at the Viticulture School of Oppenheim, Germany in 1904. So it was chosen because it has resistance to phylloxera and moderate resistance to many nematode species. This rootstock is actually a hybrid of two grape species that are native to North America, Vitis riparia and Vitis berlandieri. And so within this one grapevine, we've got three different Vitis species growing together from two different continents. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of gene banks. Gene banks are really important because the whole ability to use crop wild relatives in breeding is dependent on those wild relatives being conserved and available. And that's what gene banks do. So breeders are able to obtain disease-free material through gene banks. And then what they do is they evaluate those plants for traits of interest. This infographic here, this is part of an infographic that comes from Greene, and here they illustrate gene banks, how they acquire, maintain, document, and distribute plant genetic resources, and then how breeders will evaluate and select and cross different lines to come up with new varieties. So gene banks also provide material that is data rich, that where the species is correctly identified. It contains the collection information, where it was collected, who collected it, what time of year, what state the plant was in, fruiting or flowering, etc. And so having all of that information associated with the material is really helpful in figuring out what you can do with it. Gene bank collections aim to conserve high levels of genetic diversity within species, both from within and among populations. So this is really important when we say that we have conserved population ex situ. We want to conserve as much genetic diversity as we can, particularly with crop wild relatives, where we're looking for the genetic diversity within them to confer these key traits or new traits. And lastly, I wanted to mention that collections in gene banks require a lot of work. They require long-term maintenance in seed banks, greenhouses, orchards, other facilities. Some species require frequent regeneration. And so oftentimes gene banks are part of big national systems that maintain plant genetic resources. And in the United States, in North America, um, we have gene banks in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Each of them has a national gene bank system, and they're listed here. It's important for collections to be stored in multiple gene banks and in this Svalbard Global Seed Vault to provide redundancy. And that's in case the original collection is lost or damaged, or in case the original collection site becomes extirpated or damaged. Here, I'm going to move on. We're going to conclude our sort of introduction to crop wild relatives and why they're important. And we're going to move on to talking about crop wild relatives of the United States. And to make our way into talking about that, I wanted to show this map that quantifies the number of priority crop wild relatives by world region. Now, the US has sometimes been overlooked as an important contributor to crop wild relatives. And that is, I think, in part because it's not considered to be a place where there are many centers of diversity of domesticated species. But we do happen to have a lot of crop wild relatives. And in here, the US is seen in the third tier of importance with between 140 and 180 crop wild relatives. So you may ask, what crop wild relatives are here in our own backyard? We have a lot of different ones and a lot of different categories. And so these are just a few. We have species that were domesticated before European contact, including sunflower and peppo squash. We have other species that are considered to be more recently domesticated, including blueberry, cranberry, blackberry, and pecan. And then we also have congeners of domesticated species that include things that were that originated and were domesticated elsewhere, like grapes or apples, for example, but where we happen to have native taxa that are important, both crop wild relatives and also important rootstock, as I mentioned earlier. But in order to really know what crop wild relatives we have in the United States, we needed an inventory. And so the first national inventory was actually published in 2013 by Colin Khoury and others. And it was really, it really provided baseline information that we never had before, and a place where we could lift off and continue to grow our knowledge here. So the inventory included both crop wild relatives and wild utilized taxa. And those wild utilized taxa are those that are used directly for food, fiber, forage, medicine, ornamental, and restoration purposes. The inventory included native and naturalized species, cast a wide net, starting with around 4,600 taxa. And of those, about 285 were identified as high priority to collect. Here's a look at the numbers from that 2013 inventory. Here we have the number of wild utilized taxa and the number of crop wild relatives divided out by taxonomic group. You can see for both of these groups, it's a pretty high number of taxa, over probably a tenth of our vascular plant flora in the US. Definitely more diversity by families and genera and the wild utilized taxa than in the crop relatives. And we see here families that you're probably familiar with that have a lot of crop wild relatives in the United States. the bean family, grass family, daisy family, rose family, etc. Having an inventory allowed us to look at how imperiled the crop wild relatives are. So we took the species in the inventory and we matched them up with NatureServe's methods of doing conservation status assessments for species. And we found that about 6% of the crop wild relatives were considered critically imperiled or imperiled, this G1, G2 category, with another 10% considered G3 or vulnerable. That means that the majority of crop wild relatives are considered secure or apparently secure. And it's actually, the crop wild relatives are less imperiled overall than US native taxa. US native taxa usually fall, about a third of them are in the G1 to G3 category. So crop wild relatives aren't as imperiled. That doesn't mean that we don't have to pay attention to the ones that are. One important thing to know, particularly for plants, is that just because NatureServe considers something critically imperiled or imperiled doesn't mean that it has protection. So only 8 of the crop wild relatives are listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. So after the inventory, another groundbreaking set of publications came out. These 2-volume book set on North American crop wild relatives, and Stephanie Greene was the lead editor of the book. Karen Williams was also an editor. The first volume focuses on conservation strategies, and the second volume focuses on important species. I consider these very important reference books. I consult them all the time still. So one thing that we were able to provide in these in the first volume of this book was a closer look at the threats affecting the North American crop wild relatives. This graph is really hard to follow, but basically it's looking at different threats here on the left-hand side, and the percentage of species, either crop wild relatives compared to all US taxa, with the frequency of this threat. So what was, again, we're not going to get into the details of this, but what was notable about this was that the frequency of the most common threats affecting crop wild relatives is different from the frequency affecting rare plants in the US as a whole. So knowing the differences in these threats may help us figure out ways to ameliorate them. Ameliorate the threats, not the species. After those books were published in 2020, Colin Corey and colleagues, I was included in this one, came out with a paper entitled "Crop Wild Relatives of the United States Require Urgent Conservation Action." And I like this quote from the paper as a telling way to convey the importance of crop wild relatives. It says that taxa of urgent conservation priority are wild genetic resources of cereal, fiber, fruit, nut, oil, pulse, root tubers, spice, sugar, and vegetable crops that collectively generate more than $116 billion in annual U.S. agricultural production value. So I think that that really is a take-home message from that paper. More than that, though, the paper built on all of the data that had been accumulated over the past decade and did some really important analyses. The first thing that we did was we updated and prioritized that inventory from 2013. We widened the geographic scope, and then we created 3 categories. Category 1, focusing on priority and important crops, and then 2 other categories here. This priority group was about 821 taxa. From there, we took the priority group and we divided them further. So priority group 1A has primary, secondary. This is a primary gene pool, secondary gene pool, and graft stock species. 1B is the tertiary gene pool. 1C, species in the same genus, but we don't know their relationship to the crop yet. And these three groups were about 600 taxa. In the priority 1A group, we had about 285 taxa. So using these 600 taxa, we took data on the distributions of species from herbarium specimens, from gene bank collections, and we modeled their distributions and use them to do lots of things, including creating this hotspot map of predicted taxonomic richness for crop wild relatives and wild food plants. What's interesting about this is that there's this hotspot in the north and northeast here that does not track with floristic richness of the U.S. Most of the time, when you see floristic richness of the U.S., you see hotspots in, California, the Southwest, Texas, Florida, the Appalachian, but you rarely see this. So that's a really interesting result that came out of this, and perhaps pinpoints areas where we need to do more collecting. We also looked at the conservation gaps of crop wild relatives. In this graph right here, we looked at, on the bottom, you're seeing the conservation of in situ. The middle one, this is ex situ, and the top one is a mean of in situ and ex situ. And basically, we're looking at the proportion of taxa that fell into categories of high priority for conservation, medium priority for conservation, and low priority. So the majority of taxa in situ, in terms of their conservation, they're rated at medium priority, while the majority of taxa are rated for ex situ conservation gaps are rated as high priority. So we still definitely have some work to do to fill these gaps. The paper is a treasure trove of data. Beyond this, it includes an analysis of which crop wild relatives occur on protected areas like national parks and national wildlife refuges. It does not include multi-use areas. It includes the highest level of protection. And so you can download the supplementary materials from different sources, and you can figure out which crop wild relatives likely occur, within which national parks, et cetera, if that's of interest to you. And I can help walk you through that as well if you're interested in doing that. So from here, I just wanted to say thank you again for this opportunity. And I know we're going to hear lots more from Karen about what we can actually do to conserve crop wild relatives. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great, Anne, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes for a Q&A. Dave, do we have any questions?
We do. Thanks, Stephanie. We do. I see a couple, and if folks have more, please type them in. The first question for you, Anne, is from James Birch. He asks, old gardens are often mentioned as repositories of heritage crops. Could garden networks be used by volunteers to grow wild species of crops?
I think that's a great question. Absolutely. I mean, I think, private gardens and private collections are a big part of maintaining crop diversity. In terms of, having that diversity be available for breeders, and be part of the system, it would be important for the material that's in gardens to somehow make it into a gene bank, like the USDA, or work through an organization called Seed Savers Exchange that might do some of that kind of work to, because really when you're when you're looking at unique material, you want to know, you want to have all the information with it, right? Where it's grown, what it's descended from, what it's, you know, hybridized with, if it's known. That makes it especially useful. Karen and Stephanie, what do you guys think? You have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, when we think about conserving crop wild relatives, it's going to be partnering with as many different organizations and agencies as possible. And I definitely think that these sorts of organizations and also botanic gardens can play a really important role in conserving this material.
I just also mentioned that garden networks can also play an important role in education, and growing materials for demonstration purposes would be really useful.
Excellent. All right, great. We have another question. This is from Cynthia Toswell. And Cynthia asks, are GMO crops a threat to crop wild relatives as a potential contaminant?
Let's see. Most of the GMOs, I'll just start at first.
Yeah.
I don't think are related to the crop wild relatives that are in the US, but I think, Stephanie, haven't you done some work with GMOs?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this question. There might be some crossability with some brassica, because canola has been genetically modified, and I think there have been reports of crossing with wild relatives. I think brassica, you know, canola is about the only example that I can think of, unless there's beta. I don't know. Do we have any beta crop wild relatives? You know, with sugar beets, that's been genetically modified, but I don't think we have any here.
We just have escaped naturalized species.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's just been a handful of crops that have been genetically modified, and I think with the exception of brassica, we don't have crop wild relatives that would be crossable.
Okay, very good. We have 3 more questions that have come in, and probably after we do those 3, we should, to keep on time, we'll probably move on to the next speaker, but let's do these 3. John Putnam asks, is there significant concern over the loss of pollinators and associated impacts on crop wild relatives? Which crop wild relatives are particularly threatened by pollinator loss?
That's a great question. I have not heard of any crop wild relatives affected by pollinator loss. I'm trying to think if, you know, there are some examples in the plant world where there is a very specific, you know, plant pollinator match that needs to happen, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Most species are able to rely on a number of different pollinators, and usually, if we're talking about native species, native pollinators. So I haven't heard that pollinator decline affecting native species from reproducing and setting seed. I'm sure it's possible, but I think you'd have to kind of go species by species and try to figure it out. And I would guess that it would really be the exception rather than the rule if there was an effect.
I'll just add, I think it's something we need to keep an eye on in the future as there are more drastic changes in environments, and something, that we should be studying a lot more.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Craig Schaefer asks, some cemeteries in the Midwest have some of the last examples of some original prairie types. Has anybody surveyed these locations?
I know that there's a clover that is, I don't remember exactly where, in cemetery in that same situation, native clover, in a location where it's rare. But I think that's a great idea to do that more. Those could be, certainly those would be undisturbed areas that are fairly well protected that could be considered in the continued conservation of crop wild relatives.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't have a specific story linking cemeteries with crop wild relatives, but I know that botanists love to survey cemeteries because you always find really interesting things there. Even Native American shell middens that I've seen in Florida often have a very different flora than what's right next to them. And we don't know if it's because of things that were planted there or because the shells themselves have changed the pH. So only certain plants can grow there now. But burial places are very interesting places to look for neat plants. So that would be a neat Halloween story, Karen, if we could
Right, right.
you
We could
know,
have kids
tales from
dressing
the
up as
crypt.
crop wild relatives.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, right. Craig, thanks for that. That was seasonally appropriate. Well done. So, okay. How about the last question for this segment? This is from Bruce Byers, and it's a kind of a question comment. Bruce says, the California floristic province was extremely biodiverse, and for thousands of years, some of the most dense human populations of Native Americans lived there without true crop agriculture, depending on wild utilized plants. Do you have comments on that? Is there a map of wild utilized plants versus crop wild relatives? Maybe the California peoples didn't need agriculture. So several questions and an opportunity to comment.
Wow, wait. Okay. Wild utilized plants. I mean, I can look at the 2013 inventory and see if there is a map of them, but I don't think that there is. Wild utilized plants are a little bit harder to define than crop wild relative or kind of put in a box. There's a lot of overlap between wild utilized plants and crop wild relatives, which makes sense. I mean, I would almost look to, there have been books and there are online resources, written by Dave Moorman. What you end up getting into are sort of lists of plants used by different Native American groups for different purposes. So there is a lot out there. I'm not sure that there's a map that depicts particularly what you're asking for. And yeah, I mean, I think in terms of developing agriculture or not, I think that there's just a whole host of variety in terms of what different groups and tribes did. A lot of Native Americans living by the ocean or areas of water could rely on fishing and things like that more than sort of growing annual crops if they had an annual supply of salmon, for example. But I would guess that in almost every group that we look at, native or not, there's some level of managing the forest or managing the species around where you're living to encourage them to grow and stay there. Sort of there's in other words, there's a spectrum between, very organized modern agriculture and hunting and gathering. So people can, maintain things in their garden or in their woods that they come and sample or eat every year, berries and the like, that we may not call it modern agriculture, but they're still doing some form of maintaining that's a little bit more than hunting gathering. I think I went on a long tangent, but that could be summed up by saying it's complicated, but it's a really interesting question.
Thanks, Anne. Really appreciate it. So I think we need to move on now to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Karen Williams, and she'll be talking about the conservation of crop wild relatives, paths, and partners. Karen is the plant exploration coordinator at the National Germplasm Resources Laboratory, which is again a part of the USDA Agricultural Research Service. She's in the same lab that Anne Francis is. Karen has applied her interest in the conservation of crop wild relatives to projects both in the United States and also in other countries. And she's been doing this for quite some time. So she's one of our experts on crop wild relatives. So I'm excited to hear your presentation, Karen.
Well, thanks. Thanks so much. Let me see if I can get this presentation up. Let's see. Do you see anything?
Looks good.
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Just a second. I can't see it. Okay, still okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay, let me just minimize something else so I can see. Okay, thanks so much for that introduction, Stephanie. And I would also like to thank the members of the US Biosphere Network Agriculture Committee, including Tom Gilbert, who enthusiastically proposed this webinar, Dave Reynolds, who organized it, and Bill Gregg, who contributed many ideas, as well as all the other organizers and contributors here. Now that Anne has introduced the importance of crop wild relatives and their presence in North America, I'm going to focus on how we can work together to approach the conservation of these important plants. These 5 topics represent the 5 general areas that contribute to the conservation of crop wild relatives and what I'm calling wild utilized species. The wild as in just a different term of the wild utilized plants that Anne was talking about. These topics were summarized in a roadmap or plan developed through collaboration between a number of groups, including agricultural research organizations, botanic gardens, academic institutions, land management agencies, and conservation nonprofits. They are all interrelated. Before we can start on the conservation of crop wild relatives and wild utilized species, we have to document which are in the region we're interested in and what is their conservation status. Then we need to protect these plants in the places where they're growing naturally. In addition, we need to collect germplasm and place it in a gene bank where it'll be conserved and made available for study and use. And germplasm in the gene bank has to be managed and documented so that it's easily accessible for use. We also need to raise the awareness of all people of the value of these crop wild relatives and wild utilized species for food security and the threats to their survival. Now, to get started working with crop wild relatives in a specific area, such as a biosphere region, what should we do? As indicated in the roadmap, documentation is the first step. We have to determine what crop wild relatives are there, what their priority is as crop wild relatives, what are the general threats to their survival, and what is their conservation status. Using that information, combined with other considerations such as are there available experts, students, existing programs that could contribute and make it more feasible to make progress on this, it's possible to select specific crop wild relatives to work on. After that selection is made, then it's time to start gathering detailed information on specific crop wild relatives, such as specific populations and detailed threats on survival of these populations. Forming teams to work on these areas really facilitate the process. And these teams could be either within biosphere regions or across biosphere regions. Now, Anne's already mentioned these 3 important publications, which are really useful for crop wild relatives. And I just wanted to reiterate that they're useful as we start working on crop wild relatives. And especially want to mention that in volume 2, there are 19 chapters on specific groups of crop wild relatives in North America that have really detailed information on distributions, uses, and state of in situ and ex situ conservation that will help do the work on the ground, that good background information for that. And links to all of these resources are available in a section on the George Wright Society website. Another really excellent source of information on crop wild relatives is a section devoted to them in a database called Greene taxonomy. Greene taxonomy is an integral part of what we call Greene Global, which is the database that documents all the samples in the US National Plant Germplasm System. It includes information on nomenclature, common names, and distributions. And it also includes the genetic relationships of the crop wild relatives to the crop, which indicates how easily they could be used in crop breeding, and the types of traits, such as Anne had in the big table in her presentation, disease resistance, et cetera. And when the time comes for researching occurrences or what we call precise locations where specific crop wild relatives are found within their general distributions, so that plans can be made to actually start working on these locations, there are many sources of information that can be searched. Many herbaria that manage preserved specimens of plants have their data online, and many of them have formed consortia between different herbaria to make it easier to access them. More and more of the information that was originally in floras and field guides is being presented in apps that are easy to use. In addition, some land management agencies, such as the Forest Service, have checklists of plants found in protected areas. These aren't lists of crop wild relatives, but they can be searched for, checked for the inclusion of these species. Then there are citizen science resources that have, such as iNaturalist, that have photos and locations that have been collected by individuals. iNaturalist even has a specific project for crop wild relatives. And also iNaturalist is a great way for individuals to make a contribution to knowledge and eventually conservation of crop wild relatives. Earlier, Anne introduced the Corey and Carver paper on 600 crop wild relatives and wild utilized species in the US. And the results that formed that paper are now available in an online application, which really facilitates their use. This application was developed by an ARS unit called Partnerships for Data Innovations, or PDI. And the application presents the model distributions, the locations of past germplasm and herbarium voucher collections, as well as analyses of the state of conservation for the species. When you open the application, you get the map showing the richness map that we saw in Anne's presentation, and that can be changed. In this view, I changed the background and to the just satellite imagery, and I asked for the model distribution of a crop wild relative of grape, Vitis monticola, which we see the little in the circle down in Texas. So in addition to looking at distributions of species, we can look at other data and analyses in this application. I've zoomed in here to look at the region where Vitis monticola is, to look more closely at the place where it's located. The first map has purple dots where samples for ex situ conservation have been collected, and white dots where samples documenting the presence of the species were obtained. The second map shows areas in yellow in which more samples for ex situ conservation are needed. And the last one shows areas in pink where the in situ conservation of the species is not secure. I wish we had a lot of time to look at all these maps and all the depth of information here, but I hope this little glimpse shows how useful this application can be for examination of information on crop wild relatives and wild utilized species. So once documentation has been gathered, specific species to focus on have been selected using all of these resources, then it's possible for us to move on to the actual conservation of crop wild relatives and wild utilized species. We touched a little bit on the two complementary approaches to conservation already, the ex situ conservation and in situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is conservation in gene banks or other repositories, as Anne described. That map of Vitis monticola showed only one sample had been collected for ex situ conservation. And since genetic variation is often associated with geography, ideally, we would want germplasm collected from across that species range. In situ conservation, which is conservation in the natural habitat, allows the conservation of more diversity than can be accommodated in gene banks just because of the great amount of diversity that there is out there in nature, and also allows evolution to continue. There are several programs in the US that include the ex situ some degree or another. Some focus on only one or a specific group of species, such as the Kentucky State University Pawpaw Collection and the US Fish and Wildlife Service collection of one crop wild relative of wild rice, Sizania texina. Non-governmental programs include the Center for Plant Conservation, which focuses on rare plants, and a number of botanic gardens that include crop wild relatives in their collections. But the largest germplasm collection of crop wild relatives native to the US is the US National Plant Germplasm System, managed by USDA. The collections of crop wild relatives in the NPGS aren't nearly as extensive as the collections of cultivated species, but they are growing as the importance of these species expands. The NPGS includes 19 gene banks across the country, each specializing in different crops and their wild relatives. And samples of in the NPGS are not only conserved, they're regenerated, evaluated, and distributed. And they're freely available to users around the world for research, breeding, and education to support food security and many other types of research and uses. Now, the samples of crop wild relatives in the NPGS come from diverse sources, but many come from plant explorations, which are expeditions planned to acquire germplasm of these plants. These explorations are carefully planned so that they acquire material that helps to conserve the wide variation within each species. The office that Anne and I work in at USDA has a program for collection of germplasm, and this is one of the sources of native crop wild relatives going into the NPGS. Now, the program's not limited to crop wild relatives. It supports explorations around the world, but we really encourage proposals for the collection of crop wild relatives to fill a lot of these gaps in the collections that we have. Another source of crop wild relatives going into the NPGS is from the Bureau of Land Management-led Seeds of Success program, which collects germplasm around the country, some of which are crop wild relatives. So now turning to the flip side, or the complement to ex situ conservation, we'll talk a little bit about in situ conservation. The identification of priority crop wild relative species for in situ conservation is critical, as well as the need to locate appropriate areas for their conservation. For some species, seed storage is very difficult, such as for Zizania aquatica, a wild relative of wild rice shown here, and conservation in situ is the best option for conserving it. Protected areas in the US are key for in situ conservation of crop wild relatives. These plants occur throughout the United States, as we saw on that richness map, but and they're on lands with diverse ownership. Thus, the involvement of many partners is needed for their effective conservation in situ. A major landholder in the U.S. is the federal government. 30% of the land is owned by the federal government. And this land is mostly in the West. But as we saw in the map Ann was talking about, many crop wild relatives occur in the eastern U.S., where it's critical that we include state, county, tribal, and private partners to cover the species that occur there. In situ efforts have to be driven by the agencies that manage land, of course. Now the expertise in our agency, ARS, expertise on crop wild relatives centers on ex situ conservation. But one of our sister agencies in the USDA is the U.S. Forest Service, which is the second largest federal land manager after BLM. This makes us ideal partners for a collaboration on conservation of crop wild relatives. So that is just what we pursued and developed. This partnership is outlined in the framework shown here. It involves the designation of specific sites on U.S. Forest Service land as important for the conservation of crop wild relatives in situ. These sites are called in situ genetic resource reserves and are chosen based on a number of criteria. There are two approaches to selecting these reserves. One approach is based on the presence of important crop wild relatives related to only one crop, such as only to blueberries or only to cranberries or only to pecans or sunflowers, or whatever. But the other is based on the presence of multiple crop wild relatives related to multiple crops that might occur together on one site. We call the first approach the specific crop approach, and the second the protected area approach. For all of these reserves, the conservation in situ is complemented by the collection of germplasm of crop wild relatives in the reserve and its conservation in the National Plant Germplasm System. Now, after we developed this framework, we decided to work on a model project to see how it would work. And we chose the project to conserve the crop wild relatives of the cultivated cranberry. There are two close relatives of the cranberry in the US. One is the large cranberry, which is the same species as the cultivated cranberry, and the other is the small cranberry. Both of these wild species have been utilized by Native Americans and others. And in many locations in the East, the two species occur together in bogs. But the small cranberry is the only species that occurs on the West Coast. So this project involved the identification and evaluation of sites in the national forest with the goal of designating reserves. Sites in 15 national forests in 11 states were evaluated. And we developed protocols for documentation, for making herbarium vouchers, for collecting germplasm, and also for collecting leaf samples that were analyzed by ARS scientists and University of Wisconsin scientists to compare the genetic diversity between these different populations. And the publication shown on the right here presents the results of these genetic analyses. So these are this list is of the 15 national forests that we studied with, and the red dots, of course, on the map are the locations of these national forests. And the national forests whose names appear in red were those that were found to have the greatest amount of genetic diversity, which makes them good candidates for designation as in situ genetic reserves. So photos of the candidates, or the top candidates for in situ genetic reserves, just to show what fantastic places they are, in addition to being sites of crop wild relatives. Now I want to turn to the other approach for conservation of crop wild relatives within the ARS US Forest Service framework. And this involves the selection of reserves based on a number of crop wild relatives occurring there. And it's called the protected area approach. So these reserves would be chosen based on having several crop wild relatives that are significant, possibly with a concern about their conservation status and a number of other factors. Now, there's research botanical area in the Coronado National Forest in Arizona called the Wild Chili Botanical Area, which is an ideal candidate for the designation as a reserve under this framework. It was designated in 1999 as to protect the northernmost population of a wild chili, which is the wild ancestor of many cultivated peppers, and also to protect other species, but not specifically, more because they were wild utilized species rather than crop wild relatives. But in 2020 and 2021, we supported an inventory and germplasm collection of crop wild relatives in this area in order to initiate the process to have it designated as an in situ genetic resource reserve. And 12 crop wild relatives had germplasm collected, and 19 of them we collected herbarium voucher specimens. And these numbers demonstrate its importance as a reserve for crop wild relatives, and hopefully it can be designated as an in situ genetic resource reserve. Now, lastly, I just want to turn quickly to the need to increase awareness of crop wild relatives and mention just a few examples of many approaches that have been utilized. Every year, the Crop Science Society of America has a crop wild relative week with new postings and publicity on the topic. There are online educational materials that are, including those that are freely available at a website called Greene that include information on crop wild relatives. There's an online course from Colorado State University that covers crop wild relatives. And there have been several symposia on crop wild relatives, including this one at the World Food Prize Center, which solidified the roadmap that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So most of these have been oriented towards knowledge and conservation of a wide range of crop wild relatives. And they've involved agricultural research organizations, botanic gardens, land management agencies, and other groups. But there are many other potential partners out there for raising awareness and education, such as interpretive centers, garden clubs, master gardener programs, just as we were talking about earlier, all the other groups, master naturalist programs. Now, I think it would be ideal to have educational programs within biosphere reserves that are specific to the area, such as demonstration gardens that we were talking about, and guides to local crop wild relatives that would really bring the importance of these species home to people. So, and to sum up, I just wanted to take this chance to suggest some activities that could support crop wild relative conservation that I think could possibly be initiated in biosphere regions. Effective conservation of crop wild relatives requires collaboration of a range of participants with many types of interests and expertise. And I know many of these collaborations already exist in biosphere regions. Collaboration among biosphere regions on shared species, sharing data, and procedures would also accelerate progress in this area. These collaborations could also involve organizations not directly linked to biosphere regions, such as ARS. Some possible activities include developing inventories of crop wild relatives in protected areas and databases of occurrences, compiling procedures related to crop wild relative conservation, collecting germplasm, and developing educational materials. I also want to comment that conservation of crop wild relatives can fit nicely into other projects in biosphere regions, such as I'm eager to hear about in the next talks. There are many ways to make progress in this effort, and I really look forward to seeing what we can accomplish in the years ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, we've got time for a few questions. Dave, do we have anything in the chat?
We do. We have a question from James Birch again. He asks, how much work has been done on the codependence of crop wild relatives and other fauna and flora? And is this kind of work used in developing conservation strategies?
Me? I can't think of anything specifically focused on, crop wild relatives in that regard. I know there are lots of studies on other, they could be the same species, but just not focusing on them as crop wild relatives. But I don't know if Anne or Stephanie know of anything specifically related to crop wild relatives and the coded, the ecological relationships.
I think, Karen, I can comment that I think what we're seeing is the general lack of supporting research around crop wild relatives. These are have been species that have been flying under the radar because they're not rare and vulnerable generally. And so have been less of a priority for conservation research purposes.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I mean, species that are the few that are federally listed under the Endangered Species Act and some of the rare ones have definitely had much more research and work done on them, but you'd have to look at them species by species. It's an interesting question, though. We're getting ready to run this workshop on the conservation of native grapes, and one of the things that I've been looking at with common species is how to utilize information on habitats and ecological communities to inform not just the conservation strategies, but get a better sense of where they occur. So, some ecological communities that they have written descriptions and they might say dominated by XYZ species. And if those species are crop wild relatives, then that's a way to start kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together, that those species may be dominant or keystone species within a habitat, that kind of thing. So I think there are a lot of resources, but I don't think anybody's delved into that as a topic in and of itself.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming into the chat right now. Looking at my computer here, it says that we're at 2:07 Eastern time. Our schedule calls for a break between 2:05 and 2:15. Stephanie, with your concurrence, I would just say if we take a break now and come back at 2:15, that's pretty close to a 10-minute break. Is that adequate for everybody, do you think?
Yeah, I think that would work. That'll keep us on schedule.
Okay, well, I'd invite everybody out there to get up, stretch, take a break for a few minutes. I'll keep time here and just be back here at 2:15 and we'll start the second portion of our webinar. All right, great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, everybody, we'll be starting again here in a few moments. Okay, Stephanie, there you are. Great. All right, so Stephanie is back, and I will turn it back over to you, Stephanie, for the second part of today's webinar.
Great, thanks. And welcome back, everybody. We're now going to be moving into the second part of our workshop, which focuses on a case study looking at the Southern Appalachia Biosphere region. Evan Carter is going to be moderating this session. Evan is a conservation biologist and evolutionary ecologist with a focus on advancing a more resilience of the Southern Appalachia biosphere through both interdisciplinary collaboration and also landscape cooperatives. Evan, you want to take it over from here, please?
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm going to try to run my camera here, but I've got a very poor connection, so let me know if it causes issues. So yeah, as Stephanie said, this segment is about the Southern Appalachian Biosphere region and how we are trying to address conservation of crop wild relatives. This work on our end started as an extension, a natural extension of the Culturally Significant Plant Species Initiative. I think most folks in the audience are somewhat aware of this, especially it looks like we have several folks from different biosphere regions. And what I think this next section highlights with the speakers that we have is that, you know, biosphere regions are really unique in that we're not necessarily entities that are leading efforts. We are entities that are bringing people together and facilitating action. And so with this next section, it looks like David Anderson was able to join. So David Anderson is the horticulture operations supervisor for the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, and he's going to talk about some of the Eastern Band's work to restore cultural keystone species.
Thank you, Evan. My apologies for jumping on a little late. I'm in Wisconsin for work travel. So let's see here if I can figure out how to share my screen. Here we go. So as Evan mentioned, my name is David Anderson. I'm the horticulture operations supervisor for the Eastern Band. And the horticulture office is in the greater division of ag and natural resources for the tribe. The unique thing about our office in comparison to some of the other offices in natural resources is that we're not necessarily in a resource management role. So we're not actively out like our forestry program or air quality, watershed. We don't have a set piece of land that we're in charge of managing. Our duties and job responsibilities come in more of offering products that enhance tribal natural resources. And we get the chance to work more with individuals to enhance their landscapes as far as tribal landowners on reservation. And then we get a chance to work still on those forestry and fish and wildlife and watershed projects. But we also get to work with people like Elaine with the Niquosi Initiative on pieces of land that are tribal partnerships or partly tribal owned, or the tribe has a stake in to do different kind of projects. But kind of just went over that. But what do we do? Plant production is our main responsibility. We do educational outreach throughout the year. We do that in conjunction with North Carolina Cooperative Extension. We participate in seed banking. We are actually in the process of moving one seed bank back to Cherokee. That's a long-term germplasm that in the past has been held with the North Carolina Arboretum. but with the new Museum of Cherokee Indian archival facility being built, we're going to move that there. And then my responsibilities as seed banking relies more on short-term seed banking, or what I refer to as a living seed bank, because of what we're putting in, we're actively taking back out, growing out, and putting it back in the community's hands for landscape initiatives. Farm services, which I think is a really important point there, because that's where we get to work with tribal landowners to do kind of natural resource enhancements. That could be a crop wild relative, something like a pawpaw planting on a piece of tribal property. We could help them with the design. We could help them get hooked up with a vendor for those plant species, or if we're growing them out, we can help offset those costs by providing them. Research, most of our research in the past has been more involved with corn, traditional landrace corns, which to an extent could be classified as a crop wild relative. Our heritage corns are certainly a lot different than the modern day varieties, and certainly have characteristics of their wild ancestors that are probably going to become really important with climate change as far as their resiliency to climate change. We work a lot with pollinators. We do several pollinator project enhancements around the boundary, specifically on the Gadua farm. Pesticides, which is boring. I'll hit on that. Invasive species, which is really important for us because we're going into a lot of areas that have been attacked by invasive species, typically buffers, power line right-of-ways, or like the railroad buffer at the Gadua farm, where we're going in and we're taking out the invasives, but we're restoring in a natural native habitat. We love to make sure that we're working in wild edibles so that the community can go down and forage and harvest and also teach. And then we work on the tribal projects, as I mentioned, and those could be forestry based, they could be fish and wildlife, or watershed management based. And specifically in watershed management projects, we really, really love to once again try to create crop wild relative food forests there. So they're usually in tribal greenways, and they're publicly accessible. And so it provides a really good place for us to collect seed and plant material from, but it also provides a really good green space for the community to be able to get out and do some harvesting themselves. And so there in the top left, you can see a picture there of some of the wild potatoes, better known as groundnuts. There are 3 Cherokee wild potatoes that are acknowledged, and Apios americana is one of those. There on the top right is one of my technicians, Mr. Will Tushka, with just some traditional North Carolina and North Georgia candy roasters. Down on the bottom left is some raised bed gardening. And the reason I threw that picture in there is because those people who are pictured, besides myself, are from the Speakers Consortium. So fluent elder speakers who like to come down, they like to talk plants. I think it's really important for them to offer their insight on what we grow, what we should grow, the traditional ecological knowledge and value of our native plants. And so it's really good to have those folks out there. And then in the bottom right is just a picture of inside our old greenhouse. The facility that's pictured here, we have recently relocated from this year, so we're actually starting from the ground up again. But this is some good pictures of what we've done in the past. And how do we pick what we grow? And that picture, or that topic, comes up a lot from folks, but a lot of it comes back into community surveying. And we have an open door policy that allows community members to come into our office anytime. They might not always be asking us to grow something, but it might be just on the community member's mind. For example, wild strawberries is something that for my first 3 years, we didn't grow at all, but we recently started 2 years ago. And the reason why was in a week span, we had 3 tribal elders stop by, and all 3 of them want to talk about wild strawberries and the decline of the populations and how important it was to Cherokee culture. There's a wild strawberry story that if you guys have time and want to look up, it's a great story. So that community surveying kind of side of things is super important for us, because the folks who are accessing these wild crop relatives, crop wild relatives, they're out in the field much more than I am anymore. And so I rely on their input. What are they not seeing? What are they seeing? What do they want to see more of? And so in the past, revenue generation was a little bit of what we did to help offset some of the cost of running a greenhouse. And we were never revenue driven in what we did. We always had tribal projects in mind, seed kit giveaways, things like that were free to the community. And we never have ever charged an enrolled member for a native plant, and we never will. Those things belong to community members. But there are some things that we were growing in bulk for watershed projects or forestry projects that other restoration companies in the region may be looking for their own projects. And so anything that we had extra, we would sell outside of the boundary to help offset costs. Moving forward and going into a new facility and rebuilding, I'm not sure how much of that we're going to be doing. It's possible again, but we just don't want to get into the game of focusing on revenue rather than cultural impact on tribal lands. Of course, mentioned forestry, fish and wildlife, and watershed. The acronym you see listed there, RTCAR, stands for the Revitalization of Traditional Cherokee Artisan Resources. It's a program that's funded by the Cherokee Preservation Foundation, and it's an organization that grants out, and their main responsibility revolves around artisan resources, clearinghouses, access to materials that our traditional artisans need to do traditional artwork with. And so the way that comes back into play with crop wild relatives is something as simple as butternut. Butternut's on the decline. Obviously, it provides a really, really important wildlife benefit, ecological benefit. It also provides dye for basket makers. Bark can be used, roots and nuts, but it makes a great nut. That's milk, nut protein. That's really important. That could be hickories. It could be a number of things. So RTCAR is a really, really important program that I would encourage everyone to look into if you have a chance. The seed bank, sometimes the seed bank gets low, sometimes the seed bank's full, and based off what's in the seed bank is kind of what we pick to grow out. And it depends, from years to years. We might not have a lot of white oak, or we might not have a lot of hickory. This year we've got a surplus of butternut, so we'll be doing more of that. And so it all kind of depends on supply and demand for seed bank growing. TIPO, which is the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, I like to pick into the archives and see some kind of the cultural, historical cultural connections to plants and things that are mentioned that may not be as common now to grow. And then what I call staff scavenge. Sometimes we'll just be out on the side of the road, we'll be out on the field, and I might run across something as simple as maypops, and we might start harvesting maypops, bringing them back with us, putting them in the seed bank and storing them and growing them out. So sometimes by chance you just walk up on something that's important to grow out and you weren't planning on it, but we'll use everything we can. Top left is some picture of some Cherokee white flower corn. That's almost the perfect cob there. That was grown by Davy Bradley of the Big Cove community. The middle picture is Mr. Will Tushka once again, and he's bundling ramps for a ramp giveaway that we used to do. The ramp giveaway has since, I wouldn't say stopped completely, but we lost 2 vendors. The price of them was going up. And so we're trying to figure out a way to offset that cost and do some of our own ramp production, because the backyard ramp program was really successful in the community. People really liked it, and it really took the stress off the wild population. So really looking forward to getting back into that. And then of course the bottom left there, not necessarily a crop wild relative, but bloodroot, very, very important, something that we also do a giveaway of. So where does our office go from here? Direction's changing. As we're cutting back down on our production a little bit, we're looking for new areas to get into as a program to increase. So most likely increased farm services is going to be one of those places that we put more focus in. We want to work more with the landowners. We want to work more to protect what is on tribal landscapes that may not fall under tribal jurisdiction management per se. Seed banking, really looking forward to getting some new coolers and some new freezers in. It's really going to help our capacity as far as collecting crop wild relatives and storing them, be able to grow them out and do it correctly. We've had a lot of trouble over the last couple of years with COVID, finding companies that are willing to work with the tribe to get the plant materials that we need. The chestnut MOU, if anybody's not familiar with that, the Eastern Band and the American Chestnut Foundation have entered into a chestnut memorandum of understanding, and we've been doing some plantings on tribal reserve of back-crossed Chinese and American chestnut to do some research and restore that plant into the landscape. A 30 species limit is something I threw in there. Being a plant nerd, I always kind of stretched the stand and overdid it a little bit. And so we were growing almost 80 to 90 species at one time, and it was a little bit of a it was just a little too hard for the staff and the capacity that we had. So we're really trying to nail down the things that we know we can do really well, and that not to say that the other things aren't important, but sometimes we can get things in from other nurseries that are cheaper than we can. Those kinds of things. Increased educational outreach is really a focus of our department. We have an outreach coordinator on staff who's doing an excellent job, and we hope with her that we can do more outreach specifically on wild crop relatives. Native plant rescue is something that I know some of you guys are familiar with out of Knoxville area as a great way to get plant materials, but I've had really good successes of finding places that maybe being do some collection or to move some plants to other sites if they're just dead set on removing them. So we're hoping to do more native plant rescue that way. And then government to government relationships or government to private organizations is really important, so that the tribe is able, from our standpoint, to go into Forest Service lands or TVA lands or land collection of that we or plant material that we can use in the nursery. Top picture in the top right there, we were doing a restoration of Sochan there. The casino's been a really good partner, and they've allowed us to come in and take some areas that can't be done in traditional landscape and to restore it in some kind of native plant habitat. So Sochan, or better known to most people as the green-headed coneflower, is a traditional food to Cherokees, but it also provides a really good aesthetic value for the casino when it blooms out. And it also is a really great lake nectar source, pollinators. And so we did that with the ideas in mind that we would be able to go back, do some seed collection. It provided the casino that aesthetic value, but it also is an easily accessible place for grandparents or tribal elders who may be raising grandkids or family members to teach. It's not easy to get into the rugged landscape of our home sometimes for some of these folks to teach about what these plants are. And so down at the bottom, you can see our, it's kind of worded funny, but our Bradford Pear Bounty Program. And that's something we've had pretty decent success with, and moving forward, we're gonna mix up our crop wild relatives and cut down on the button bush and the river birches as a way to incentivize folks to get rid of Bradford pears. Why is what we do important? Increase biodiversity, cultural preservation, and sustainable communities moving forward with climate change. Creating these areas for food forests, for food hubs is super important. But I just want to point out this menu on the left-hand side to everybody. This menu hangs behind what we pick for what we're going to grow there at the nursery. But if you take a look, 1949 Cherokee Indian Feast, if you look down that list of the offerings of what was served, you've got blackberries, huckleberries, strawberries, raspberries, elderberries, wild plum, wild cherries, crab apples, ground cherries, persimmon, field apricots, fall grapes, fox grapes, possum grapes, dewberries, gooseberries, of course, all the nuts. And how cool is that? That was the menu in 1949. Our standpoint, we would love to see all these things back on the menus at the annual fair, which we just had last week or 2 weeks ago. And I mean, all those things look delicious. There's so many crop wild relatives listed. Several of those things are but we want to increase those offerings. We want more people trying those things and are able to enjoy those things, and so that folks can also teach with those things so it can be passed down. Culture is cyclical, and you can't take one of these things out of culture and it still be complete. We need that. We need all these things. Food sovereignty, as I just mentioned, is really important. And one of the things we focused on over the past in the community, and it's a very social thing. So the more people we get out viewing those things, learning about them, seeing them, eating them, the more the awareness of crop wild relatives can grow. But we like to encourage the grower through those farm services. We like to encourage our community members to plant more of these things on their landscapes. I won't go harp too much on food sovereignty, but crop wild relatives are a huge part in tribal food sovereignty. And so as you see there at the bottom, I won't read off all those points, but what a great definition of food sovereignty and how important is as crop wild relatives into those points there. So some simple examples of some of the crop wild relatives that we've produced in the past and will continue to produce would be crabapple, different land-raised sunflower varieties, specifically the world sunflower that's almost extinct. It's endangered for sure. There's very few populations of it left. Our huckleberries, our wild grapes, sunchoke being another wild potato, and the American chestnut. And I called it the American chestnut because of the fact that we're so used to eating Chinese chestnuts anymore that we don't really know the difference. And that most people's taste buds have changed for Chinese chestnut. But the trees that we're planting on tribal reserve currently, they're over 90% American. And so we might not ever see them fruit in our lifetime, but our grandkids, great grandkids, they'll be able to enjoy them. They're going to get a lot different taste and enjoyment and a lot different nutrition from the back cross versus the Chinese. Just throwing in another blurb here for hickories. I'm a hickory enthusiast, and so we've done 5 different species at the nursery in the past. It's an important artisan resource. It's a very important traditional food, and it also provides a really great ecological and wildlife value, and that's one of the reasons we choose to grow hickories in the nursery. But if you look in the top left corner, that would be a canunchi ball. It's a traditional food, and it's made from ground corn, sometimes black walnuts, sometimes butternut, hickory nuts, and they're all ground together. And the milk nut kind of protein sticks the ball together and holds it. It's eaten a lot as dessert style, but they are absolutely delicious. I encourage anybody who's never had one to enjoy it if you can. Down in the bottom left is a picture of a set of Cherokee ball sticks and that is made from hickory. And so we have to find a balance between what we're harvesting for artisan resources and what we're leaving for food value and education and for the wildlife. Wild strawberry, as I mentioned earlier, has been a real big success for us. The first seeds that I received actually came from Monticello, from Thomas Jefferson's collection. And I always love his description of it takes 100 to fill a pint, half a pint. And so that's so it's not funny, but it shows like what our childhoods were like of having to harvest wild strawberries and it taking all day to barely get any. They're delicious. They're traditional food, traditional stories surrounding those, but they're also a great ground beef supporter. Bank a little bit, like I mentioned earlier, it's a living seed bank. What we do, we're actively putting in and taking out. We're putting it back in the community's hands as fast as we can. We're going to increase our educational resources side of what we do. We're going to continue giveaways of native plants, specifically crop wild relatives. It's community driven. We do it with food sovereignty in mind, with our culture in mind, and with traditional ecological knowledge in mind. And so there at the bottom, you can see no self-respecting Cherokee would ever be without a corn patch. And not sure who said that, but I always throw that in there. So I just want to wrap up there and say thank you. Look forward to any kind of questions or discussion points that anybody might have. There on the left is a picture of us making some hominy, and that's traditional white corn that's been nixtamalized with hickory ash as the lye. So once again, hickory comes back into play in several different components of Cherokee culture.
Thanks, David. So I think we might go over a little bit, and I'm going to propose that we kind of, Elaine, feel free to go into the Q&A time a little bit. But our next speaker is Elaine Eisenbrand. She's the executive director of the Niquosi Initiative, and some folks on this call know her from work that we partnered on with the Gateway Communities Initiative, and it attempts to and will continue to do so to extend Elaine's vision for a cultural corridor. Elaine she's a great example of how we can go from the work with the tribe and take that traditional ecological knowledge and the important cultural points and apply that through on the ground work, outreach, education, but also integrating that with real conservation. So Elaine's going to talk about contemplating the crossroads, culture and crop wild relatives.
Hi, everyone. I can't share my screen until David stopped sharing. It's telling me. So David, can you unshare?
I'm in the attempt to right now. Let's see.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can. Oops.
While he's doing that, I'll just say thank you, Evan, for that lovely introduction and for all the work that you do. Thank you, David, for being an enduring, loyal partner. We're all focused on pulling in the same direction, and that's great. And I thank everyone for the work they're doing here. Oh, look at that. That's giving me the chance. Oh, no, not yet.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
But thank you for inviting the Niquosi Initiative. Here we go. There, that looks like it's working. Thank you for inviting the Niquosi Initiative to share our work, let you know what we're doing, and specifically in context with the biosphere reserves and with, in particular, crop wild relatives. I'm really excited to share what we're doing and to relate it to the work that you guys are doing, and particularly with what David and his co-members at EBCI are doing. Our organization is focused on preserving culture and heritage. And excuse me, they are clearly parallels and even specific overlays between our work and our topic today, which is crop wild relatives. So Nikwasi Initiative is a small, what I call community sector organization, commonly known as a nonprofit, but I use the term community sector organization because it reflects a greater sense of responsibility to the community that's served, and to longevity of projects, and to society at large. And so today, community sector organizations have to be kind of entrepreneurial in order to create enduring impact. So how does that relate to crop wild relatives? Nikwasi Initiative's concept or brand of entrepreneurism is focused on attracting people to foods, landscapes, and lifestyles that they may not be familiar with. This is commonly known as heritage tourism or cultural tourism, and it's an impactful entrepreneurial tool to carry a message to wider audiences and to achieve sustainability. So we consider our task to be taking the theory and putting it into practice on the ground in a way that assures their sustainability of the resource by way of striving toward this kind of return on investment. And I'll explain in a minute. That doesn't necessarily mean dollars, but we'll get into that. And one more thing I want to share about Nikwasi Initiative is it's a bridge organization, a bridge between communities, a bridge between cultures. And by design, our board is half Native American and half non-Native. So that's a huge bridge and a wonderful way to bring communities together to solve some of these problems that we're all focused on interculturally. And then I'd also say we're a temporal bridge by educating people about kind of that thread from people of the past to people of the present to people that will come tomorrow. Culture means growing. Can you guys all see that? I don't know if your names are covering my slide. They are on my screen, but I hope not on yours. So culture means growing. And we have a tendency to slip into a definition of the word culture that's more about traditions and practices, which is a little bit more static than to think about culture as a dynamic thing, growing, changing, and taking the heritage that we get from our predecessors and using it in order to create the best society that we possibly can, create the best individual of ourselves that we possibly can. So I encourage you throughout this presentation and throughout your lives in general to remember to think of culture as a growing sort of concept. And I think if everyone did that, it would really help us interculturally to embrace our own cultures and understand each other. It's about developing healthy societies and sustainable, clean foods. So let me go on to the next slide here. Let me build an even stronger relationship between our work and crop wild relatives. So I want to share that presentation of a culturally integrated message is best done through multisensory engagement. Like what David was showing you on all those beautiful slides. People had their hands on things. They get to taste things. They get to nourish their body with things. So that multisensory engagement is really important and a piece of everything that we do. I'd also say that changing food behaviors may be the premier challenge in sustainable agriculture preservation of crop wild relatives, and really in societal health. And then the third point that's associated with that is foods are multisensory. You all know that. They satisfy taste, smell, touch, sight, even hearing, really. And can you imagine touching or tasting quinoa pod, maybe the spark that initiates huge change, particularly for an enrolled tribal member? Anyhow, this image that is showing here is Noquishii is the mound in the right-hand picture, that circular green area. It's the largest unexcavated mound in the Southeast. It's currently kind of encroached by roads and industry. And this is from a plan that we created with a lot of input from EBCI members and organizations or departments and local people around the Franklin area where it's located, to build a learning center. And that learning center is intended to grow crop wild relatives and indigenous plants and various native plants that are not frequently found on our landscape anymore. Both inside the building, there's a lot of glass on the south side of that building that we're repurposing, and outside as well. And this is designed to give people an opportunity to come and experience those plants as they're growing in the ground. And hopefully someday we'll have a restaurant there that's serving some of those plants so that people can have a full body experience with them. So here's one example of a project we're doing. This couldn't have happened without our relationship with David Anderson and the horticulture team. So this is a sign that's up at the Cherokee Heritage Apple Trail. Now, apples obviously are not crop wild relatives, but the process of preserving traditional crops, in this case, specific varieties of apples that were originally developed by Cherokee farmers before the removal on the Trail of Tears. And so these apples have been planted in a publicly accessible orchard, and people can go there and learn the origin of Cherokee developed apples, and they can, smell the blossoms in the spring and taste the apples eventually, have all those multisensory opportunities. And it invites people from far and wide, because there aren't too many places that you can go and really taste an apple that wasn't designed to sit in a square box and be bred to ship more than it is to taste and create good pies and such. So by increasing the number of sensory inputs, we increase the likelihood of people carrying concepts home with them and perhaps getting closer to a desired behavioral change, like I was saying in the last slide. Here's a couple of additional projects, and I'm going to throw some in that are not pictured here. So Niquosi Initiative has sort of spurred these projects. On the left is the Interpretive Trail and Medicine Trail at the Junaluska grave site. This is a project that is owned by EBCI and managed by EBCI. Our role was to raise the money to replace some of the signs on the crops. And you can be sure that the plants growing out there, some of them are crop wild relatives, and even those that aren't are very closely associated with them and have important temporal bridges from past, present, and future for people to learn. So this is really relative to what we're talking about, and it gives people a deep immersion in the landscape and with a highlighted product. Not shown on this slide is another place that is using the same funding as the Medicine Trail, and that's the EBCI, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Community Forest, we call it Hall Mountain right now, but the Speakers Commission or the Speakers Council has voted to change the name to something that's more Cherokee. I believe it's going to be Eagle Mountain, but that's not for sure yet. So at Hall Mountain, we're putting up interpretive signs that share some of the native plants that are growing there, the air quality information, identify specific plants and what's special about them, and eventually could include crop wild relatives as well. On the right-hand side of this image, you're seeing the Cherokee Heritage Blueway Interpretive Trail. And this will take the same kind of message from a terrestrial landscape onto an aquatic one, so that we can find eddies and access points along the rivers and share with people what's important there, why the rivers are so important to Cherokee, what plants grow in the riparian area, what plants require an alluvial plain, et cetera, et cetera. And it gives people a reason to be coming to a waterway beyond just soaking in the sun, paddling, getting a little exercise. They leave with a whole additional experience and perhaps paradigm. So, and then another one that's not on here is, Evan's already mentioned it, with the gateway communities, is together with the local biosphere reserve leaders, we're talking about installing perhaps crop wild relative specific gardens in public domains. And that would be amazing to be able to do. What I want you to note here throughout this, we've got a theme. The projects all invite people to a working landscape. They offer multi-sensory immersion. They showcase culture because everyone understands culture. Everyone has their own culture. And then they create an intentional return on investment. That return on investment can be monetary, it can be behavior change, it can be social progression, etc. But that's an important piece of it, especially for a community sector organization like us that doesn't have a defined flow of income to keep these projects going and maintained. So I want to get back to the entrepreneurial aspect a little bit. What we're talking about here, what I've been talking about, is destination cultural tourism to raise awareness. David spoke about how important it is to raise awareness, and we're taking that theoretical concept and putting it into actual practice on the ground. Destination cultural tourism is a burgeoning business right now, and it's something that we all, as environmentalists, landscape managers, should be taking advantage of, because not that we want to overrun the landscapes with people, but when we do capture people on the landscape, we want to educate them and make their trip valuable and send them away with a new way of perceiving the world. So this destination cultural tourism can be integrated into food systems and crop wild relative education and history education. There's growing science about destination tourism, and some of it is based on what's showing on the slide here. Today's travelers are motivated by authentic culture, and that I would add with that outdoor recreation. Authentic culture is, according to a survey, the #1 travel criteria for the millennial generation. And that said, baby boomers are participating in authentic culture tourism even more than millennials. So it must be right up there at #1 with them too, though I haven't seen that statistic. They want to have wellness benefits in what they do, and they want to have deep experiences that can transform and shift perspectives. I think overall, crop wild relatives offer a really fresh and inviting allure to travelers. Here's this whole new landscape of educational opportunity, outdoor experiential opportunity. And so even if crop wild relatives need to be integrated with complementary offerings that can sort of carry the load to create a complete product, we still get an untested attraction with really high potential for social change. And I think that's a huge opportunity that we all need to embrace. And we're willing to come and help you do it with yours, or call us and we can give you ideas. A great, great opportunity. With that, I'm going to close my sharing. Oops, it already says no, I did. Stop sharing. That's what I want.
Thanks so much, Elaine. I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie or Dave for questions. We've got to move into our wrap up, but I think we probably could fit in a question or two. I know the only question that I saw during this was for David on intertribal collaborations.
That's right, Evan. There is a question from Bruce Byers. I'll read it, and it was directed to David, but maybe Elaine, you could also respond to from your perspective from the initiative. I think it might be applicable to you. So Bruce is asking, have you contacted and collaborated with other tribes, whether that's in other biosphere regions or not? Have you contacted and collaborated with other tribes on utilized wild species and crop wild relatives and their conservation and restoration? I'm interested in the status of intertribal communication and collaboration on this. So David, maybe you could go, and then Elaine. Is Dave?
I'm not sure David's with us anymore.
Not here. All right. Well, Elaine, why don't you, can you respond to that from your perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. I've got to say that the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians is absolutely stellar in their partnership skills and their willingness and really excitement about partnering, not just with local organizations like ours. They work with all different tribes. I'm constantly calling someone at EBCI and hearing that, no, they're visiting such and such a tribe. And a lot of that does evolve from the Natural Resources Department. They're extremely active in not only going out to other US tribes, but they've been known to travel internationally to share agricultural and horticultural knowledge, wisdom, ideas with other tribes. So yes, they absolutely do. And I'm sure they're very open to doing more of it.
Okay, well, I think we just have time for a quick wrap up. First of all, I wanted to thank all of the participants for joining us for the last 2 hours. Also, a big thanks to our presenters. I thought that all of the presentations were very, very informative and interesting. So a big thank you for that. And then also wanted to thank Dave Reynolds and Dave Harmon for all their work that they've done to organize the whole workshop. If you're interested in learning more or developing crop wild relative conservation plans for your biosphere region, please be sure to leave a contact information in the chat before you sign off. And then I just summarized a few of the further information. We talked about a lot of resources that are available to learn more about crop wild relatives, and encourage you to seek these out if you have an interest. And then I think as a final wrap up, I think Dave Reynolds or Dave Harmon, did one of you also wanted to speak a bit, right?
That's right. And thank you, Stephanie, so much for your moderation. Dave Reynolds, the president of our board of directors, he's on the call. There he is, Dave. Do you want to just say a couple things about George Wright?
I do. But first, I wanted to echo what Karen had said earlier in her statement that I wanted to thank people in the Agriculture Committee who worked on this. But I really have to particularly thank Tom Gilbert, because he was not only the one who focused our attention on crop wild relatives, he also focused people's attention more than 30, 40 years ago on the Man in the Biosphere program, and was instrumental in getting that started. And then later in the 90s, helped create this Southern Appalachian Man in the Biosphere Reserve or region. And more recently has been involved in the US Biosphere Network. So Tom, we just wanted to thank you for your help. And now Tom is on our Agriculture Committee. And Tom, I should say, also was the first president of the George Wright Society. So he's been a very busy person and continues to be. And for those of you who don't know about the George Wright Society, we're an organization that strives to foster excellence in the areas of parks and protected area management, in terms of cultural resource management, natural resource management, interpretation, education, and protection, and the different disciplines that are in parks and reserves. We are people, but what we do is bring people together, and a lot of our members include community leaders as well as park professionals, as indigenous peoples, and we do that through a professional journal that we produce several times a year. We also have put on workshops such as these, and seminars, and have been putting on conferences as well. So I just wanted to encourage you folks to take a look at our website, look at the journal, and if you're interested at all, join our organization. Thanks.